Yes, indeed, as I've been introduced, my name's Olaf. As you can probably tell from the slide that's up, that I work for IBM. I work in their digital business group and am responsible for helping put together material to help people get familiar with their newer cloud offerings like Kubernetes, serverless or cloud functions kinds of things, as well as object storage. A bit about me. My first contribution to OpenStack was on the Essex release. My first trip to a summit was in San Diego in 2012. I served shortly as the PTL, the ultimate PTL, for the ill-fated app catalog project in OpenStack. I live in North Carolina in the United States on the East Coast and flew all the way here to talk to you guys, you wonderful people, about Istio. So, the agenda for what we'll be talking about today, or in our short talk. I'm supposed to start with a thought-provoking statement. So we'll do that first, followed by some definitions to help our talk along. Then we'll actually get into some Istio, and then how we get Kubernetes onto OpenStack. This wonderful thing that Istio allows you to do, called mesh expansion, will be our next to last subject, and then we'll end with some new things available in Istio 1.0. So, you can go on the internet and find a statistic to say pretty much anything you want to say. In my case, I found this one from a company called 451 Research. And they claim that by the year 2021, that there will be over $3.5 billion spent on containers in various clouds across the world, up from a projected $1.5 billion this year. I'd say that's not bad, considering Docker is only 5 years old, and Kubernetes itself, Kubernetes 1.0, that is, was released in July 2015. It's it's not huge. It's not defense spending or anything, but it's a decent amount of change to be spending. And I think the point I was trying to prove with that is merely that, containers only seem to be getting more popular, not less, and for the foreseeable future will continue to do so. What is Istio? Who here has heard of Istio? Anybody? A few people? Cool. Anybody installed Istio or running it currently? Rock on. I'm a big fan of definitions, especially when you're starting a conversation. So before we answer this question about what is Istio, there might be a few more concepts that might help us define what Istio is, like what is Kubernetes? And if we're going to be that thorough, let's go ahead and define one more thing. What is a microservice? Yes, I initially titled my talk Managing Microservices with Istio. I hope the event planners can forgive me for changing the name on them last minute. But yeah, so that's what I get for trying to stick too many buzzwords in a talk title. So now I have to define microservice for you guys. And according to Wikipedia, there is no definition, blank. There is no industry consensus yet regarding the properties of microservices, as well as a definition completely lacking. Lucky for us, we can now make up our own definition of what a microservice is. I don't know that I definitely want to define it, but we can talk about some of the characteristics that a microservice has. Usually some of their defining characteristics are include being independently deployable, and I misspelled that, nice. So something that's independently deployable, something that's easy to replace. You probably have in your mind a good idea what a microservice would be. One of the things I've also heard microservices called is small in size. I don't think that's fair. I'm a short person from where I come from. Small in size does not necessarily matter. You might have if you have a Hello World application, that might be considered small if all it does is print to the console. A database server that runs your entire application, would still be considered a microservice, but I don't think anybody would call that small. Anyway. So we scaled that. Now this will take us back. Now we can start retreating in our list of definitions and head back to what is Kubernetes. From their own website, Kubernetes defines themselves as a portable, extensible, open source platform for managing containerized workloads and services that facilitates both declarative configuration and automation. Well, what in the world does that mean? Simply put, it's a way to manage a bunch of containers or microservices, whatever you want to call them. This is taken straight from the documentation for Kubernetes. There's a sample app they have called Guestbook, and yeah, that's the URL. You can go and follow the tutorial and install it, and what you'll wind up is a diagram that looks slightly like this, or you'll have a Kubernetes cluster with pods in them that look roughly like this. You have goes you through setting up a Redis master, a Redis worker, and then a front end PHP. It has you step through scaling that to 5, back down to 2. But essentially, these are represent 3 different services or 3 different pods on a Kubernetes cluster. And each one of those would be considered a microservice. Now back to our initial question, what is Istio? And according to their documentation, Istio is a completely open source service mesh that layers transparently onto existing distributed applications, allowing you to connect, secure, control, and observe services. Once again, we've got not a very useful definition because there's more words in that definition to define, namely service mesh, one of the things we're here to talk about today, a service mesh, which is the network of microservices that make up these distributed applications and the interactions between them. So, in the last slide we were just looking at, where we had a Kubernetes cluster already, we had a service mesh, but we just couldn't look at it. Obviously, all those services there, the front end talks to the Redis server, they all talk to each other. But you can't really see much of what is going on behind the scenes, which is why we now have Istio. Istio expands upon all the things you can do with the Kubernetes cluster. It lets you do load balancing for HTTP, gRPC, WebSocket, and HTTP traffic. More features of Istio include fine-grained control of traffic behavior with rich TPC traffic routing rules for retries, failovers, fault injection. You get a pluggable policy layer and configuration, API supporting access controls, rate limits, quotes. My favorite part of Istio, I think the coolest thing is the metrics, logs, and traces you get. It just comes along with installing Istio. All of a sudden you can read logs to your heart's content and know exactly which services are talking to each other, how often, who's mad at who. And finally, but certainly not least, is secure service-to-service authentication with strong identity assertions between the services in a cluster. So you can make sure, you can fine-tune that and make sure that all your traffic's getting routed the way you think it's going to. Another way we can talk about Istio is their components. Istio, the main component in Istio is Envoy. Envoy is a separate, so the first one up there, Envoy, is the main driver of Istio. It's its own project in the CFC. It's its own full project in the CNCF. It's used by other systems besides Istio, and it's injected in front of each of the microservices that you put it in front of in a Kubernetes cluster. You can even think of Istio as a way to essentially install Envoy and control it. So yeah, controlling Envoy is what these next 3 components do for you. Pilot is the main controller of Envoy. It deploys configurations to each of the envoys in your cluster. Citadel used to be called Istio Auth. They just renamed that with a recent release, and as you can probably guess from the name, it handles authentication. And then finally, Mixer. Mixer is the guy that sits there and keeps track of all the telemetry, keeps track of which traffic's heading in which direction and how much of it exists. A quick diagram, so Istio architecture, this is what you get. So this is just the Istio part. I'll show you that on top of a Kubernetes cluster in just a second. But so what we were talking about with Envoy is the proxy part. You can see the bridge between the two gray squares. Those would be your pods or your services, seeing as how they say service A, service B. The traffic between them is what gets measured by Mixer in the middle. It's doing the policy checks and the telemetry. Like say Pilot is in charge of those proxies and telling them what their jobs are, and then Citadel is handing out TLS certs to each one. We can now, I should mention data plane. So the Envoy is essentially the data plane, and then you can see under the last three, that's considered the control plane, which has its own API. We apply this to our previous example where we had Kubernetes cluster set up for the guestbook application. It's not labeled very well, but the yellow bars would be your Envoy proxies, and then each of those is talking to the control plane. So the yellow bars are the data plane. Three things at the top are the control plane, the part of Istio, and then the rest of the rectangles at the bottom colored are the actual services pods of the Kubernetes cluster itself. Oof. Yes, more about those, the data plane, the Envoy proxies. It's a piece that's touching every single packet, so it sees every bit of information that's going in between these two, in between these three services. It does the filtering, it's emitting the stats, it's doing the logging and the tracing, and then your three other parts of Istio at the top, the control plane, are the orchestration piece. There is what's taking all the proxies and sticking them together in a larger system. To use our previous example, the data plane is where the rectangles were, and I already said all that. So now we finally get to the nitty-gritty, Istio on OpenStack. How are we going to get Istio on OpenStack? Well, first, we have to have Kubernetes. Because Kubernetes, or Istio, installs on top of Kubernetes. So in OpenStack, there's this whole new idea of a Kubernetes admin. KADE is an abbreviation for Kubernetes. I'm sure you're already aware. But Kubernetes admin, he can create the cluster using OpenStack API. There's also the idea of a Kubernetes user. The Kubernetes user in OpenStack can just use the cluster. They don't get to see the OpenStack APIs that do all this behind the scenes. And how is this now achieved? By this new development in the OpenStack world called the Kubernetes OpenStack Cloud Provider. This was highlighted in the most recent summit in Vancouver, and is OpenStack's idea, or at least their attempt to become more Kubernetes friendly, as more and more people want to use Kubernetes. Let's see, how do I go back? Previous? Not quite done with that one yet. So the Kubernetes services, what does this bad boy do? The Kubernetes services sometimes need stuff from the underlying cloud. They need services, they need endpoints, and that's the goal of this new provider. The perfect example of this in Istio is the Istio Ingress, which is part of Mixer. Istio Ingress depends on the Kubernetes load balancer service type. So it asks, it relies upon this new OpenStack cloud provider to interact with the OpenStack load balancer as a service to create a load balancer, and then add the endpoints so that your Istio instance can now get a endpoint or get an IP address on the main network that your OpenStack cloud is running. And this is my favorite part of the whole idea of why you would want to make OpenStack run Kubernetes in the first place, is the idea of mesh expansion. So now that you've got this, you've got your OpenStack cloud, and you've got Kubernetes running on your OpenStack cloud, and Istio telling you everything your Kubernetes cluster is doing, you can expand that service mesh, which is what Istio is called, and you can now you can include not only virtual machines from your OpenStack cloud, but also bare metal instances, which, you know, some people would say, why you want to do that? Others would say, great, this is awesome. You think, you know, there's not every app that's out there is ready to be completely containerized yet. Especially for security reasons. I mean, there's plenty of people that don't like the fact that that containers share kernel, so they're not isolated and therefore not necessarily as secure as a VM, or maybe you've got a legacy application that just simply won't run in Kubernetes or run as a container. So this allows you to have the best of both worlds. You can have a Kubernetes cluster that's attached to other virtual machines and even bare metal if you need to. It's not a super straightforward task, really. There's some things you need to do on the networking side, obviously, with your cluster, but also any kind of VM or bare metal machine that you're going to try to expand a mesh around. We'll need at least these three things. You'll need to be able to talk to the Istio service and the pod endpoints. So you can get a net plugin like Calico to make sure that the network agrees across the two from the cluster and back. The secrets stored in Kubernetes that it puts into all of your pods so that they talk to each other and have your VM's not going to have those secrets just out of the box because Kubernetes didn't create it. So you'll have to make sure all that gets onto your virtual machine. And then to be able to discover new services, also your VM that's outside of your cluster is not getting any kind of DNS records that Kubernetes would be. Should I just use this one? So yeah, you're going to need to find a way to get DNS records back and forth to your cluster, or sorry, to your VM. You can do that using a relay. You could use DNS mask. The easiest way is obviously static entries in a host file, but there's nothing. So that's a quick down and dirty way to get it rolling. But ideally, some kind of relay would be best, so that you're always getting updates across your entire new service mesh. So that's a good part of Istio. The service, I would go more into the service mesh, but more into mesh expansion. So Istio 1.0 was released on July 31st, 2018, so it's not even a month old. It had some more improvements, including multiple clusters are now allowed in the single mesh. You can use Helm charts. In fact, they recommend that all you use from now on is Helm charts to define your cluster and your Istio integration with them. You get out of process adapters from Mixer, and the best improvement ever, mesh expansion is broken. So, yeah, that kind of derailed my presentation to you guys a bit today because they just broke it a month ago. So there's not a lot of reason to go into how exactly that gets done until they get fixed. I have it under the best authority from these guys that they're working on a solution as quick as possible. But for the moment, you can't really do that unless you're going to want to go back to either Istio 8, Istio 0.8 or 0.7 something, which I'm not a big fan of working backwards. So if you haven't done it yet, it's not a big reason to go either way. Yeah, I talked a little bit quicker than I meant to. So now's the part where I say thank you to lots of people. First, I have to say thank you to IBM, who flew me out here to talk to you guys. If any of you have any interest in an IBM cloud account, that first link will set you up with a free IBM cloud account. That's ibm.biz. It's a capital B, lowercase d, capital Y, lowercase z, capital T, capital S. We have lots of resources for Istio, lots of tutorials. You can launch a Kubernetes service if you want to play with Istio, but all of our tutorials almost all of them should work on a Minikube local environment, so you wouldn't need to actually use that at all. Those are my Twitter accounts and my GitHub. Like I say, IBM has plenty of resources at the developer.ibm.code site. I need to give a shout out to Tim Swanson. I used a good bit of his research in doing this presentation. And now, if you don't mind, I gotta get this. Everybody smile. Yay! Thanks, guys.
I'm sorry. Yes. I'm sorry. May have some questions.
Yeah, sure.
May have some questions. Yes. You actually have lots of questions related to Istio because for example, Nokia right now we also have plan to move to the Istio. I mean, we plan to try because we have a lot of problem with the microservice. For example, we are going to use right now we are using gRPCs. So every time we're changing, the format is a gRPC. So we have to rebuild a lot of microservices.
Sure.
So, so I have lots of questions. The first one is, do you have the result of performance or overhead of Istio?
So of course there are some because instead of the services or the pods talking to each other straight away, you're now you're shoving sidecars, you're shoving proxies in front of every one of them. So instead of service talking to service, it's now service talking to a proxy talking to a proxy, and proxy then talking to the service it meant to. So there is some overhead, but from what I've seen, unless you're trying to get your reaction time down to below milliseconds for financial reasons, it's pretty negligible.
Yeah, and naturally, we do not have any kind of the reason for benchmarking or.
I don't have hard stats, but I've certainly seen people check into it, and it's nothing that is exorbitant, and they should be even getting better, I think, especially with Istio 1.0. They've, Envoy does all the checking for certificates itself now instead of passing that along, which sped things up even more.
Okay. And do we have support for UDP?
I don't think so. That's a good question.
And then we're gonna have it in the future, right?
Like I say, they just released 1.0, so and it's catching on quick. The community is growing, so if it's not there now, it probably won't be long.
Yeah, and my last question, is how. So right now we have a lot of solutions for API gateways. So for example, Kong API or such of this solution, and how does Istio live with the API gateway, and can they live together?
That's a good question. Like say, once they get service mesh expansion fixed, we'll have a better idea of how they're handling that with the IP gateways. They've done a lot of work, like say with the new cloud provider. to make Kubernetes easier, much easier to install and much straightforward. But I would assume that the whole IP address issue would get more clear and more straightforward.
And do you think like this still will be kind of solution to connect the VM and the container solution? Like as I saw in your presentation, like the VM needs something, right? So it means like Istio will have the VM can connect to Kubernetes cluster.
Sure. Like say, one of the things that Istio 1.0 allows is multi-clusters, more than one cluster to be in a service mesh, and it'll be, this isn't specific to OpenStack, and I'm sure that the other cloud providers, Amazon, everyone like that will be offering it, within their own cloud offerings eventually. And I mean, there's no logistical reason that they can't, a service mesh couldn't span, multiple clouds. You might have a hard time getting Microsoft and Google, and Amazon to work that way, but if they're your own clouds, sky's the limit.
Okay, I'm done.
Cool. Thanks, guys.